The welterweight champion has seen a changing of the guard and an unlikely new champion emerge in July of 2024, which in my eyes seems like a transitional phase in this legendary division's history, which is a great time to look back on this division and its history, from dominant champions to legacy stealing underdogs, all the way to some tough as nails fighters who just never knew when to call it quits. With 12 undisputed welterweight champions to this point, it's a great time to look back and rank them. This is the Fight franchise and every welterweight champion ranked from worst to best. Number 12. Carlos Newton, the second ever welterweight champion and an early pioneer in the UFC's welterweight division before it began to skyrocket and become a premier division of the sport. Newton began in the UFC in 1998 competing at UFC 17, where he competed in a middleweight tournament, losing in the final to Dan Henderson. He would then relocate his life to Japan, fighting in Shooto and Pride, going on a 5-fight win streak across multiple promotions. He would then lose in a bout versus Dave Monet and then would be competing back in the UFC in the co-main event of UFC 31, where he was facing inaugural champion Pat Miletich in round 1, where not much happened, and round 2, where Newton had a bit of control, but the jiu-jitsu ace couldn't do much with his control. It went to round 3 after an eye poke and separation and more control in the grappling from Newton. However, Miletich would scramble and get on his way up. However, Newton would jump for control and would cinch up a bulldog choke, securing one of the most epic submissions in the UFC's history, and would become undisputed welterweight champion. He would be defending his title against Matt Hughes next, where they had an iconic and controversial end to their fight. In a bout with a lot of grappling and wrestling, Newton looked for a triangle, with Hughes picking up Newton and putting him up against the cage, where Newton held onto the cage for support. Big John McCarthy informed Newton no grabbing the fence, where he tightened the triangle. However, Hughes slammed Newton to the canvas and knocked him out cold. However, replays and audio heard after heard Hughes admitting he went out cold, so questions were raised on whether or not Newton should have still been champion. Nonetheless, Hughes was crowned victorious. He would take a fight in Pride, then rematch Hughes for the belt, losing via TKO, where his career would slowly fizzle out from there. With one title match win and not many bouts or wins in the UFC, Newton comes in last on the list, but nonetheless had an iconic win and achievement, winning the title and becoming the first Canadian champ in UFC history. Number 11. BJ Penn. Yes, the legendary BJ Penn, who was one of the best lightweight champions of all time, was also welterweight champion in the UFC. Penn would start in the UFC at a young age, competing in the lightweight division, losing in the tournament final against Jens Pulver for undisputed gold, and would fail to capture gold again in a draw versus Kyle Uno. He would go to K1 and defeat Takanori Gomi and would return to the UFC in the welterweight division and compete against, at the time, the record holder for the most title defenses in the division's history with 5, and one of the best fighters in the world at the time, Matt Hughes. After a failed takedown from Hughes at the start of round 1, BJ Penn dominated Matt Hughes, sitting in Hughes' guard, landing elbows and having great control for most of the round. With the round coming to an end, BJ Penn would get into mount, and Hughes would turn and give his back to Penn, where he secured the rear naked choke to secure a monumental upset and one of the best wins in the division's history. This could have been the beginning of an epic title reign. However, for the next 2 years, he left the UFC and competed in K1, where the landscape of the division would slowly change. Penn would return and face GSP in a title eliminator and lose in a close fight. However, with Hughes beating GSP, Penn got a rematch, this time losing by TKO. Penn would have more bouts at welterweight, including a failed attempt at beating GSP for undisputed gold, but would go down to lightweight and have a legendary run. A lot like Newton, only one title win, no defenses, and not too many bouts and presence for the division. However, who he won the belt against compared to Newton was much more impressive, and his close competitions versus GSP, plus being one of the early champs in the UFC, gets him a higher spot than Carlos Newton. Number 10. Matt Serra. The winner of arguably the biggest upset in UFC history, Matt Serra is a difficult person to place on this list. As compared to the last two, their wins don't seem as lucky as Serra's. However, Serra's win to the title may be more iconic. Matt Serra started in the UFC in the early days, competing in the lightweight and welterweight division with mixed results, where himself and many of his counterparts of that era who had fought in the UFC already would compete on the Ultimate Fighter, where the winners at the end of the season would earn a title shot at undisputed gold. Serra would do brilliantly, winning the Ultimate Fighter, beating Pete Spratt, Shoney Carter and Chris Littell in the final, where he would earn a world title shot against GSP, who had just won the title against Matt Hughes, and was looking like the new breed and next level of MMA fighter. With no one really giving Serra a chance, he did the unthinkable, causing arguably the greatest upset in MMA history, when Matt Serra would KO GSP in the first round to become undisputed champion. GSP would get a rematch and would get revenge, KOing Serra in the second round to regain his title. 3 more fights followed for Serra and then he would retire. Serra and the previously mentioned Newton and Penn didn't have the greatest welterweight careers, but what edges Serra, he arguably beat the best welterweight of the three to win the title. However, you could argue Hughes was more in his prime than GSP at the time of either's loss, but Serra, for the history and the upset, just ranks slightly higher. Number 9. Johnny Hendricks. Johnny Hendricks was one of the most difficult people on this list to rank, as he arguably has one of the best rises to the top of this division. However, once he got the belt, his decline was so unbelievably steep. Hendricks would join the UFC from the WEC, where he would get to 9-0 in the UFC, losing a bout to Rick Story. Now, from here onwards, Hendricks' career took an amazing turn. He would go on a 6-fight win streak across 2 years, KOing and flatlining people among some competitive back and forth fights, including a title eliminator versus Carlos Condit, where he would beat Condit to earn an undisputed world title shot versus GSP. Hendricks and GSP would have a back and forth bout where Hendricks pieced up GSP, leaving his face a bruised mess, where when the final bell went at the end of round 5, many people thought we would be hearing and knew. GSP retained his title in a controversial decision and would take a break from the sport, where many people from the media and Dana himself thought Hendricks won. This led to Hendricks facing Robbie Lawler for vacant undisputed gold at UFC 171, where he would win a decision. This was followed by a rematch between the two 9 months later, where this time Robbie Lawler would win the title from Hendricks. From this fight onwards, Hendricks was never the same. Many factored this is due to USADA coming into action, where Hendricks' power, physique and ability diminished, where he fizzled out of the sport. For having a close loss which many thought he won versus GSP, and beating a legend in Robbie Lawler earns him a decent spot. Number 8. Bilal Muhammad. At the time of recording this list, the current undisputed welterweight champion, and a man many people would have probably never thought would be on this list. However, Bilal Muhammad's amazing history he created in July of 2024 and his wins and win streak in the division is what gets him above those before him. Bilal Muhammad started in the UFC in 2016 at 9-0, where he would lose his first fight in the UFC and would get 5 wins and 3 losses in his first 8 UFC fights, where following a loss to Jeff Neal, Bilal Muhammad would build up an amazing streak of wins. He would win 4 in a row and be paired up with fellow up-and-coming contender Leon Edwards, where the two squared off, where it seemed Leon was getting the better of Bilal on the feet, but the fight ended in a no contest due to an eye poke from Leon, which meant Bilal couldn't continue. The two went their separate ways, where Bilal amassed an amazing win streak against some stellar competition in the division, dominating Damian Maia, Stephen Thompson, Vicente Luque, and even finishing Sean Brady. He would then be paired with Gilbert Burns, beating him in a 5-round domination, where Bilal, without the eye poke mishap, was on a 9-fight win streak and had a title opportunity in a rematch versus Leon Edwards. Bilal got revenge for the eye poke, dominating Leon in a great performance, where he would win the unanimous decision to become the unlikely welterweight champion. What ranks Bilal higher than all the previous before him is his body of work in the welterweight division, with a 10-fight win streak with great wins amongst them. Just a shame he isn't finishing them or having spectacular performances, or he could rank higher. However, as he is the current champ, the sky is the limit with the chance to climb higher on this list. Number 7. Pat Miletich, the inaugural champ and the man who paved the way for this legendary division to become what it is today. Pat Miletich started training MMA at 26, where he learnt to train in karate and BJJ, where he was fighting out of Illinois in multiple bouts in one day, where he slowly started competing in other areas in the US, taking his record to 17 wins, 1 draw and 1 loss, where he would fight at UFC 16 in a welterweight tournament, winning the tournament. At UFC 17.5 or UFC Ultimate Brazil, he would face Mickey Burnett for the inaugural welterweight title, where they fought in a 1-round bout at the time, where Pat Miletich would win the decision and become the inaugural welterweight champion. Miletich's reign is very weird, as he would rack up an impressive amount of 4 successful title defenses at the time. He would at the same time compete in other promotions, losing on numerous occasions, which unfortunately knocks him down a bit, as he would defend his title at UFC 18 but then lose in a lightweight bout at Super Brawls 11, but then would win versus Andre Pederneiras, but then lose 6 months later in WEF. Then he defended his title against John Alessio, but would lose in rings versus Tamura, and then defend his title via submission versus Yamamoto. After his title win versus Yamamoto, he would lose to the earlier mentioned Carlos Newton. Pat Miletich gets huge credit for being the first champ, getting 4 defenses and getting finishes in some of his defenses. Just the losses in between hinder him going any higher, but credit to him for taking those fights and being an active fighter of the times in and out of the UFC. Had the UFC offered activity at the time and had built up the welterweight division, he could have potentially been way higher on this list. Number 6. Robbie Lawler. One of the most beloved fighters in this division's history, and when you see this finalized list, you will see how heavy this division is with wrestlers and grapplers. Lawler is one of the rare few in this division's history to make it to the top with his striking. However, it was not an easy road to welterweight glory. Robbie Lawler got started in MMA at 19, getting himself into the UFC by 20, where in his first run he would go 4-3 and then would leave the promotion, fighting in multiple promotions where for 3 fights Elite XC would become his home, winning the middleweight title there until Elite XC was forced to close and Lawler would move on, taking his trade to Strikeforce with mixed results. The UFC would purchase Strikeforce, which included their roster, and Robbie was back in the welterweight division, winning 3 in a row in 10 months and would earn a title shot losing to Johnny Hendricks. Lawler would beat Jake Ellenberger and Matt Brown and earn a title shot against Hendricks, getting revenge, beating him in a great back and forth fight where he showed brilliant determination to win. He showed even more determination in his next fight in a war for the ages versus Rory McDonald, securing an amazing KO to defend his title, and then had another war in a close fight versus Carlos Condit to defend his title again. His reign would end there, losing his next bout in a 1-round KO versus Tyron Woodley. The grit and determination Lawler showed within his title reign was unmatched, and going on a near 14-year streak to lift UFC welterweight gold is unmatched on this list. The amazing 2 great title defenses, wins against some great fighters, Robbie Lawler deserves his high spot on this list. Number 5, Leon Edwards. In terms of winning the title alongside Matt Serra has arguably the most exciting title win on this list. In terms of fight style and entertainment, Leon Edwards on this list would rank lower. Nonetheless, his body of work across the welterweight division earns his high spot in the top 5. Leon Edwards would join the UFC in 2014, losing his first bout and then winning 2 in a row, and then losing to Kamaru Usman. Leon, a striker many wouldn't favour to have success yet go as far as he would in such a wrestling and grappling heavy division, but he proved the world wrong, winning 8 in a row, majority to be decisions with some great wins versus Vicente Luque, Donald Cerrone and RDA, where he would face the previously mentioned Bilal Muhammad, where the contest ended via eye poke. However, it did seem Leon was getting the better of the exchanges in the fight. He would then have a 5-round fight dominating Nate Diaz, however in the 5th round have a scare being rocked by Diaz, but would survive to the final bell. On a 9-fight win streak with 1 no contest, he would earn a shot at then reigning champion Kamaru Usman. He would have a brilliant first round but would be dominated in rounds 2, 3 and 4 and the majority of round 5. With 1 minute left and looking like he is about to lose a decision to Usman, he landed a head kick and one of the best KOs ever, putting Usman out cold in one of the best come from behind wins ever to win the undisputed gold. He would defend his title in a rematch versus Usman, separating himself from his rival in a decision win, and then would beat Colby Covington in a comfortable decision, but would lose his title versus Bilal Muhammad. What lets Leon down going higher is his lackluster title defenses and run to the title. He won the belt in epic fashion, but his title defenses and road to the belt were relatively comfortable decision wins. Had he been ending people like he did Usman in the second fight and beat Bilal, he would have maybe ranked slightly higher, but a fair place for Leon Rocky Edwards to rank. Number 4, Tyron Woodley. At one point in time, Woodley was calling out GSP to a bout and was considered as being on the chase to GSP as the greatest welterweight of all time, and next thing you know he is being flatlined by Jake Paul in boxing. Woodley started in MMA relatively late, having his first pro bout at 27, going on an excellent streak of wins, being signed by Strikeforce and winning 10 in a row, and would fight for vacant welterweight gold in Strikeforce, losing to Nate Marquardt. The UFC would acquire Strikeforce and Woodley, and he would compete in the growing welterweight division, where he would win 3 and lose 2 in his first 5 fights in the UFC. He would then KO Dong Hyo Kim and then beat Kelvin Gastelum, and then he would face Robbie Lawler for undisputed gold. He would brutally KO Robbie Lawler in round 1 to become undisputed champion. He would then face complex karate striker Stephen Thompson, where they competed in a fun fight which ended up being a draw. They would rematch, but this time Woodley would beat Thompson and brush him aside. He would dominate Damian Maia in a boring performance, but is a good title defense as Maia was on a great streak at the time. He would then beat surging and undefeating Darren Till, submitting him in the second round, ending his hype train. He would be dominated and defeated by Usman, where he would go on a career skid for the ages, being dominated, having some humiliating losses. Woodley is a strange character to rank. As a top 10 welterweight list, he may not rank this high, but in terms of the belt, he has more defenses than anyone before him except Pat Miletich, but Woodley faced better competition than Miletich. As this is ranking them more as champions, he deserves his higher spot, even though he had some bad performances once he was dethroned. Number 3, Kamaru Usman. the modern day legend of the welterweight division, who buzzsawed through his competition straight to the top in dominating fashion. Usman was a collegiate wrestler who would go and try and compete in the Olympics. However, he failed at the Olympic trials and would transition to MMA, where he would go 5-1 and then compete in the Ultimate Fighter, beating the competition and winning the final versus Haider Hassan via arm triangle to become the TUF Season 21 winner. He would from here go on the greatest streak in welterweight history, securing some brilliant wins, beating the likes of Leon Edwards, Wally Alves, Sean Strickland, Damian Maia and Rafael dos Anjos along the way. 9 wins in a row. He would earn a world title shot versus Tyron Woodley. Usman would mop the floor with Woodley, dominating him, making Woodley look below average, winning a 5-round decision to become the undisputed world champion. He would then go to war versus Colby Covington in a 5-round fight, where he would win via 5th round TKO, where Usman showed his heart and determination in an epic bout. He would then beat Sergey Masvidal at UFC 251 in a boring and conservative performance. He would then face teammate Gilbert Burns, where Usman showed so much improvements in his striking, dropping Burns in round 3, securing the TKO. He would rematch Jorge Masvidal in the first event with a full arena, where Usman would flatline Masvidal with a brutal KO, being the first person to finish Masvidal in over a decade. He would face Colby Covington again to defend his world title in a great performance, solidifying himself as pound for pound best in the world and one of the best welterweights ever on a 15-fight win streak. He would face Leon Edwards in a bout where he was looking to tie Anderson Silva for the most consecutive wins in UFC history, where he was on his way to winning a dominant decision, but he would be head kicked with 1 minute to go to lose his title and undefeated streak in the most shocking of circumstances. He would rematch Leon and fail to recapture gold, where Leon was much more improved and Usman would be out of the title picture, and he hasn't competed at welterweight since. 5 title defenses, the longest win streak in the division's history, and dominant wins and performances against the best of the best in the division. And remember, he had beat Leon early on in his UFC career. The only thing letting Usman down is not having more title defenses, and also his title defenses being against 3 people, facing Masvidal and Colby twice. Had he had a mix of styles and competitions, he could have ranked higher. Nonetheless, bronze is a great spot for the Nigerian Nightmare. Number 2. Matt Hughes. Matt Hughes is a true legend of MMA and the welterweight division. Matt Hughes got started in 1998 and competed at UFC 22 while he was fighting in promotions all across the world. Hughes got his big break when he would beat Carlos Newton for undisputed gold, slamming him to the canvas to KO Newton. However, controversial as it seemed upon replay, Hughes went out to a choke. Nonetheless, he would leave Vegas as champion. He would then defend his title against Hayato Sakurai via TKO in the 4th round, and another 4th round TKO against Carlos Newton, ending the saga from the first bout. He would then defend his title versus Gil Castillo and then beat Sean Shirk, and then beat Frank Trigg via submission to get a 5th title defense and at the time break the record for the most consecutive title defenses in welterweight history. He would then lose to BJ Penn as previously mentioned, losing his title, but BJ Penn would leave the UFC following that bout. So he would face GSP at UFC 50 for vacant gold, stopping and finishing GSP via armbar. He would then beat Frank Trigg in a rematch from their previous bout, securing another 1st round submission in an epic bout. He would then submit Joe Riggs in his next bout, but it was a non-title bout due to the fact Joe Riggs missed weight. And then he would beat Royce Gracie in a catchweight non-title bout, but would then face the only man to best him on this legendary run, BJ Penn, stopping Penn in the 3rd round to get revenge and another successful title defense. He would lose via TKO in his next bout to GSP, losing his title. He would beat Chris Lytle and then rematch GSP in a trilogy bout for interim UFC gold, where he would lose to GSP once again, where from here on he was out of the title picture and his career slowly came to an end. A 2-time world champion, 7 overall successful title defenses, wins and finishes against the best of his era, amazing fights, one of the only 2 men to beat GSP, Matt Hughes is a legend of the UFC, MMA and well deserves his silver medal. Number 1. Georges St-Pierre. In some people's eyes the greatest MMA fighter of all time, Georges St-Pierre is definitely deserving of the number 1 spot, and you all saw it coming. GSP would get started in 2002 where he was 5-0 and would join the UFC. He would beat Cara Parisian and then Jay Heron and face Matt Hughes for undisputed gold, where he lost in the 1st round via submission. No knock on GSP as this was Hughes closer to his prime and only GSP's 8th fight in his career, so he still had a lot to go until he got to his prime. GSP GSP would go back and compete in Canada, and then return and beat Jason Miller and then Frank Trigg, and Sean Shirk and then BJ Penn in a close bout, where he earned a title shot once again versus Hughes, beating and avenging his loss to Hughes in the second round via TKO. He would then lose to Matt Serra in a monumental upset which no one saw coming. Following the loss to Matt Serra was a streak, which is what gets GSP number 1 on this list and in contention as one of the best of all time. He would beat Josh Koscheck by decision and then face Matt Hughes for interim gold, beating him by submission in the second round, and then a rematch versus Matt Serra for undisputed gold, and would win the bout via TKO in the second round to successfully get revenge and his belt back. What followed this was 9 consecutive title defenses, beating John Fitch, BJ Penn, Thiago Alves, Josh Koscheck, Jake Shields, Carlos Condit, Nick Diaz and Johnny Hendricks, where he dominated most of them except Hendricks, which was a close and competitive win. Following the Hendricks win, he would leave the sport and return 4 years later and win middleweight gold versus Michael Bisping. An amazing win streak, the most title defenses in the division's history, wins over a who's who of the division at the time, and his 2 losses in his career he avenged. GSP easily deserves the number 1 as the greatest welterweight champion in UFC history. Did you enjoy the video? Let us know down in the comments below. Who do you think is the greatest welterweight champion of all time? Put that in the comments below, and leave your ranking of welterweight champions in the comments below. Leave a like if you've enjoyed the video and subscribe for more MMA and fight content coming soon. We hope you enjoyed the video and we'll catch you in the next one.